I think when you look around the world today and you look at some of the big discussions that are being had about the Belt and Road Initiative, about Chinese global infrastructure, there's a big emphasis on the economic side of this discussion, right? Can developing countries take on multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects? Is this a good idea for them to do this, right? What about things like debt sustainability? What about the financial returns on these projects? And similarly, on the side of China, does this make economic sense and can this continue? And, I think all of those are really important questions, and I'm very glad they're getting lots of attention. But what I try to do in this research is to provide more of the political perspective of these projects, both from the perspective of host countries in the global south, and of course, from the perspective of China's government as well. And this is where I think historical context is really valuable. So, over the past couple of decades, the economic story of China's global infrastructure, again, has been really important. But what I do in this research, as you suggested, is I look at the 20th century as well. I look back at several decades of China's aid and lending overseas. And it turns out that, of course, China's not a new donor or lender in global development. It's also not a new provider of infrastructure. It's been building and financing big infrastructure projects in Africa, different regions of Africa, and different parts of Asia and other parts of the developing world for decades now. And what I try to show in this research is that, yes, we need to understand the economic logic, but if you want to understand why this type of project, why overseas infrastructure projects have been so persistent and so tenacious within China's foreign policy over time, we have to understand their political logics as well. And basically, what that means is trying to understand from a political perspective why developing country governments continue to desire these projects and why China's government is willing to provide them. And since the 1960s and 70s, when China's government first started to do this, all the way up, if we fast forward to the going out strategy in the early 2000s, or the Belt and Road Initiative, right, launched under Xi Jinping in 2013, all the way up until present, these have consistently been national level projects that are negotiated by governments on both sides. So these are very high level projects. And in addition to any economic calculations and goals, oftentimes we're looking at political actors that also have political objectives that they hope to achieve. So developing country governments want to oftentimes deliver these big national infrastructure projects that can be these landmark projects in their countries. And sometimes China's financing and support for infrastructure is one of the only options available. And then on the side of China, there are all types of different objectives in terms of China's influence in the world and other political objectives that China can pursue in providing these projects. So that's sort of the backdrop for why I think it's important to bring the political logics into the story in addition to the economic ones. I guess I would start off by saying that I think it's really important for researchers to provide this kind of data because, again, if you look at a lot of the mainstream conversations, particularly outside of China in places like the United States and some of its partner countries around the world, conversations about China's global infrastructure and what the motives and the effects of these projects are, I think have often been really dominated by one or a few narratives that I think oftentimes are these simplified pictures of reality that help people try to make sense of the world and of the situation, but that aren't necessarily based on careful research and are not necessarily even accurate. So providing data on China's actual aid and lending and other, development cooperation activities around the world, I think is absolutely essential. This is a very difficult task, as you allude to. One of the reasons why is that we've known for a long time that China's government is one of the really important actors in global development in terms of providing development capital all over the world. But China doesn't participate in some of the major reporting initiatives worldwide to report information on its overseas development assistance, for instance. It's one of the relatively less transparent donors and lenders, perhaps the least transparent major donor and lender in the world. And this has created a big data gap that many of us have tried to fill. doing that has not been easy at all. So I've been studying China's overseas aid and lending projects for the past 12 years. And the challenges are still with us today. I can give you a few examples. One of the biggest challenges of trying to track China's projects around the world, both infrastructure but also other kinds of projects, is what is the appropriate definition and what types of measures should we use? In the real world, different donors and lenders have different they think about aid and development finance in different ways. So, the way in which China's government might think about its development cooperation around the world is quite different than, say, how Germany does, or how the United States does, or maybe a multilateral organization like the World Bank. And so, on the one hand, we want to have standard definitions and measures and basically protocol that will allow us to collect the data in a way that will facilitate meaningful comparisons. So we can say, well, let's see what China's government is financing in sub-Saharan Africa, and how does that compare to what the United States is doing, right? We want to be able to make apples to apples comparisons. But this also requires us to face this difficult question of what are the measures and standards that we should use. So that's a persistent challenge because different actors in international development have different ways of thinking about their activities, right? Another really difficult challenge is what we call following the money. So oftentimes, particularly if you're trying to build data that's using open sources or relying on a mixture, a combination of government sources, official sources, as well as media and other public sources. Projects are sometimes announced in one way, but they happen in very different ways. So, how do you follow the money? How do you track the status of a project that was committed maybe in 2012? It's important to follow up and see whether or not that project actually happens, right, in 2015 or 2016. Maybe the project was announced as a $100 million loan, but maybe as the project goes on, the amount of the loan changes, or some of the terms of the loan change, or different actors become involved. And so oftentimes how an aid project actually shapes out is very different than how it is initially announced. And it's really important to follow the life cycle of a project and to try to track its actual status in real time. But that can be very difficult when the information is not available. Another consistent challenge is, what do you do when you find two or more pieces of information about the same project that tell you different things? When you have conflicting information, how do you choose which piece of information to believe, right? This is a common problem. Again, oftentimes the reporting on these projects varies, and you have to make decisions, and you have to try to develop, again, a systematic and a consistent way to make decisions about sort of inconsistent information as well. One final challenge, which is particularly difficult for some of the historical data collection I've done, is what do you do when you just can't find the information that you need? Maybe you know what you're looking for, but oftentimes it's the case that you scrape through all the information you can possibly find and you just can't find what you're looking for. You can't find the financial value of a certain project, or you can't find the status of a project or the different contractors who were involved in it. You just have to, be transparent and make sure that you're qualifying within your data that there are, gaps in the data that need to be sort of registered and reported. And this is, again, particularly challenging for the historical data because the historical record on, say, Chinese aid projects in the 1960s or 70s and 80s is just not nearly as detailed as it is for more recent, say, Belt and Road projects, for which we have lots of information. So all of these are big challenges, and the data that myself and lots of other scholars have tried to create, I don't think anybody has the illusion that it's just this panacea, it's this perfect solution to this data problem. But I do think it's a big step in the right direction in trying to, be able to have an objective information sort of foundation to analyze what China's doing in the world. I think in the past couple of decades, if you look around developing countries throughout the global south, if you look at what politicians and leaders in these countries say, and also if you look at what public opinion in these countries says, I think it's clear that China's development cooperation has developed a rather unique reputation in international development. I think there are some positive aspects of that reputation and some negative aspects, right? And this ultimately gets to this question of what is the value proposition of Chinese infrastructure and other types of development cooperation with China for developing countries. So on the one hand, um, people in developing countries, both people who are, in positions of decision making, but also just everyday people, they tend to view Chinese development finance, including Chinese infrastructure, as being faster and more tangible, and as being something that China can deliver quickly and with less bureaucracy and with less red tape than a lot of other potential alternative options, i.e., traditional, what we might call traditional donors and lenders, bilateral and multilateral donors and creditors from the US or from other OECD member states. So China has a reputation for being, China's government and Chinese companies, right, for being faster, for getting these big projects done and really delivering on them, even in situations where other potential sources of financing, might not be willing to finance a certain project. And I think this speed and this pragmatism is generally appreciated. At the same time, and I think relatedly, when you prioritize things like delivery and speed and just getting things done, meeting urgent development needs, there are always costs and benefits to any approach. And in this case, I think China's also developed a reputation, again, fair or unfair, regardless. Objectively, this is what sort of the data suggest. It's developed a reputation as having less emphasis on things like pre-project risk assessment, both in terms of economic and non-economic risks, right? Also, when it comes to different types of standards that a lot of Western donors and lenders, care a lot about, things like labor standards and environmental standards, right? Environmental sustainability assessments. China does not have the same type of reputation for really investing heavily in these types of things. And these two pieces of China's reputation go together, right? So when you prioritize speed and getting things done, that means that you might put to the side some of these other sort of slower, more costly, painful processes that go into assessing the economic and the non-economic risk of a project. Now, in fairness, I don't think we should think of China or other actors as being so monolithic in international development. I think China is changing, and I think the Belt and Road, for example, is entering into a new period where this type of risk assessment is really important. But over the first 10 years of the Belt and Road, for example, I think this is sort of the way in which a lot of people think about Chinese infrastructure projects in their countries. And so I think ultimately that creates an interesting situation where China is a very promising, but also maybe a pretty risky option in terms of providing infrastructure, right? So there's a lot of promise that it can deliver on big infrastructure projects, but there are clearly going to be some risks here as well. The last thing I would say is that, I think it's important that we analyze China and any other actor for that matter, not in a vacuum, but in proper context. And so if you look historically at Chinese financing, and even if you just look at other countries, both in the contemporary period and historically, big infrastructure projects around the world have always had a track record of controversy, of sometimes economic underperformance, right? Of going over budget, of taking longer than expected. These are just inherent features of big infrastructure projects. And I think what we've learned in the past 10 or 15 years is that China's BRI infrastructure and Chinese global infrastructure is not immune from these tendencies. And in fact, some of the characteristics that I was mentioning about China's approach could even make it more vulnerable to some of these infrastructure tendencies. But I do think this context is something that is often missed in popular debates about China and infrastructure and the BRI that is really important for sort of helping us make sense of where this fits into our broader knowledge about infrastructure and development. We've known for a long time in research and political economy of aid that donors and lenders all over the world use aid and lending and other types of development finance to pursue their strategic goals, right? We don't tend to think of these donors as being these benevolent actors who just want to help other countries. We tend to assume that they usually have their own objectives in mind. And so I was interested to understand the influence consequences of China's global infrastructure. And one of the reasons I wanted to really unpack this is because, again, if you look at popular debates, there is a very strongly held assumption in many parts of the world that indeed China's global infrastructure is leading to Chinese global influence. But for me, I wanted to better understand exactly what that meant and how that was happening. And I think one of the important parts of this process is really clarifying what we mean by influence. So if you're an aid donor or a lender, be it China or someone else, what are you most concerned about, or what are you really trying to achieve? Are you hoping that an infrastructure project that you build overseas will win hearts and minds and increase your soft power and increase your favorability among audiences abroad? Are you instead primarily concerned about trying to secure diplomatic support for a key political issue? Do you want both of those things? So what I tried to do in this research was really clarify what we mean by influence. And I think what was helpful here was separating influence into two different categories, right? So we might think about donor and lender influence in terms of what you call high level or elite influence, basically the ability to get other governments to do what you want, versus what you might call popular influence, or what a lot of people refer to as soft power in international relations, winning hearts and minds, right? Increasing, favorability towards your government among foreign audiences, right? And so I think when we separate out elite and popular influence, this helps us shed some light on how Chinese global infrastructure connects to China's influence around the world. And if you look at all of the available evidence that scholars have amassed over the years on these topics, I think it's pretty clear that Chinese global infrastructure has been and continues to be a very important foreign policy tool for elite influence. One of the examples I look at in my recent book, Chinese Global Infrastructure, is this very consequential 1971 United Nations General Assembly vote in which the PRC unseated the Republic of China, the government in Taiwan, as the sole legitimate Chinese representative to the United Nations. If you know the backstory of this resolution, developing country support for the PRC was extremely consequential. And one of the things I show in the book is that China provided a lot of global infrastructure projects, so really big, high-profile projects to countries that would go on to vote for it in this resolution, as well as in the years following this resolution, providing a lot of these infrastructure projects potentially as a reward for countries' loyalty and support diplomatically during that resolution. I think when you turn to the sort of the soft power popular influence side of the equation, the evidence is a lot more mixed. So a lot of scholars have tried to look at whether Chinese development finance affects public attitudes towards China. And what I think that the overall takeaway there is that context really matters. There are some studies that suggest positive results. Some studies find negative results. Some studies find null results, right? And I think it really depends on the context, and it's also very difficult to identify what we call sort of causal effects, and really be able to confirm that changes in attitudes are really due to these infrastructure projects. So one area that I think is quite promising and interesting is the growing use of survey experiments to look at whether or not Chinese global infrastructure projects are actually positively affecting attitudes towards China in developing countries. I think it's really important to point this out. The Belt and Road Initiative and China's overseas infrastructure, even though it's been around for a long time, this is not a static phenomenon that never changes. And I do think we're in a period of major change and major shift. And China's own government has made this clear, right? The Belt and Road and China's overseas engagements are moving towards, at least for now, smaller, more sustainable projects, more greener infrastructure, and as you pointed out, more digital infrastructure. Um, I do think it's important to put this into the broader picture. I don't think this is an absolute shift. I do think that traditional infrastructure, much of what has really defined the BRI over the past decade, is also going to remain an important part of the story. After all, there are lots of BRI projects from the previous decade that are still being built and that are still coming online. And when you think about big mega infrastructure projects, even in your own country, right? These are projects that take many, many years to really play out, if not decades. And so we're going to be parsing through the evolution and the consequences of hundreds of these big BRI projects for a very long time. Even though China is shifting to new forms. Now, in terms of the greener and the more digital infrastructure, I think this presents an interesting opportunity for China's foreign policy. Uh, One possibility is that if China is successful in shifting the Belt and Road towards overall more sustainable projects from an environmental perspective, perhaps digital projects that have less of a negative environmental footprint, right? And also projects that can be more financially sustainable, right? That don't necessarily saddle low income countries with unsustainable debts. This could be a good thing for China's image in international development, right? So some of the sort of reputational liabilities that you could argue have really been hurdles for China and its reputation in the world and in the global south. Things like inadequate attention to environmental standards, inadequate attention to financial transparency and sustainability. China could potentially improve its reputation on some of those metrics, right? Now, it's also important to point out, though, that this shift, I think, also will represent costs for China as well. So building in more pre-project evaluations, building in more emphasis on, again, really figuring out economic and non-economic risks before deciding whether to fund a project. That is not something that is just done for free. That takes time, that takes money, and that will make these projects more costly as well. I think another way in which the BRI is evolving is that, again, China is not a monolith, and the different actors on the Chinese side that have been involved with the BRI, for example, different Chinese government agencies, right? Chinese policy banks like China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, and of course, Chinese companies who traditionally have played the role of contractors in a lot of these overseas infrastructure projects. The roles of some of these actors are evolving as well. One particularly notable trend is that Chinese companies now are exploring new financing models to take on more equity, right, and take on more ownership in some of their overseas projects. And so again, this is a dynamic situation where China's overall priorities are evolving, as are the specific priorities and roles and strategies of different BRI actors. And I think in a global perspective, we are seeing an emerging trend of different types of Chinese actors working with new types of international partners. So, with co-financing, I think you mentioned the AIIB. The AIIB, in its first 10 years or so of operation, it's almost at a decade, it has done a whole lot of co-financing, right, with traditional bilateral and particularly multilateral donors and lenders. But we also have, again, Chinese companies and other types of Chinese actors working with international organizations and international non-governmental organizations on new development activities in the global south. So this is an exciting part of the story, and I think all of these actors are, exploring new ways to invest in productive projects, but not necessarily using the old sort of financial models and the old sort of partnership forms that we saw. So the BRI in its first decade was very much defined in terms of China's infrastructure projects as Chinese party state financing, primarily through China's two policy banks. And many of these projects were implemented by Chinese state-owned enterprises. But I think we're seeing new forms of infrastructure engagement abroad. I think that's a very good thing. I hope it will be able to scale to a larger scope. And I think there's a broader point here to be made as well, which is I think we're potentially seeing some convergence between China and some of the other major development actors in the world. So, on the one hand, we've been discussing how China's approach is changing. And there is, in this new chapter of the BRI, at least for now, there really is an emphasis on financial and environmental and other forms of sustainability, right? Basically, having more effective risk assessment, moving sort of China's approach a little bit closer to some of the different standards and values that I think some of these other actors really care about. But I also think it's important to look at the other side, right? So China's reemergence in global development over the past 2 decades, particularly in the infrastructure realm, I think has really pushed a lot of these other donors and creditors around the world to renew their emphasis on infrastructure. Many other donors and lenders in the world had basically stopped financing big infrastructure projects. And what I think is particularly interesting is that a lot of the actors who have been most critical of the Belt and Road Initiative and of China's approach in the global south are simultaneously the ones that feel it quite urgent and necessary to provide new forms of infrastructure and alternative choices for infrastructure to developing countries, maybe even to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. So, another way to put that is that we are seeing a little bit of convergence from the other side towards China's infrastructure heavy approach over the past couple of decades. So, it's possible that different actors in development are converging in these ways, and hopefully that will lead to more partnership, more discussion. Unfortunately, a lot of international development cooperation is very much colored by broader trends in international relations, and China and the United States, China and a lot of other major donors and lenders are in a very difficult period in terms of their bilateral relations. But in terms of what's actually going on the ground in developing countries, I do think we're seeing some convergence, and I hope that opens the space for more productive conversations based on actually getting good projects done for developing countries rather than letting geopolitical tensions spoil that.